Thank you all so much for joining us for this professional development workshop on communication basics for virtual interactions. We're so honored to have students and early career researchers participate from across Turtle Island on what is currently called North America, plus from Australia, China, Scotland, and Nigeria participate in the annual training meet. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Robyn. I'm going to save the spiel this time around and let Robyn introduce herself. I'm so honored to pass it back to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Alexa, and everyone at MEOPAR. I'm delighted to be here as a part of your meeting. Quick overview of me. My name is Robyn Roscoe, as it says. I'm coming to you today as the principal of a consulting company known as Lyric Management. During the day, regularly, I am the Director of Management and Administration at the BC Cancer Genome Sciences Centre, which is a part of the Provincial Health Services Authority. And now I'm going to share my screen so you can see a little bit more about what we're going to do today. This is focused on virtual communications, a presentation that I'm calling Being Seen and Heard in a Virtual World. I want to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from my place of work, which is at my home, which is within the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Squamish, Musqueam, Stolo, Tsleil-Waututh, and Tumeenis nations. And we are all treaty peoples. As I said, I am the owner and principal operator of Lyric Management, where I deliver training, consulting, and career coaching, as well as event management. I'm also the Director of Management and Administration at the Genome Sciences Centre at BC Cancer, and I'm an instructor at Mohawk College in the Research Administration Certificate Program, delivered jointly with the Canadian Association of Research Administrators. On the slide that you see here, you'll see that there's a bunch of contact and link information for me. If at any time after the session you have a question or you'd like some additional resources or you'd just like to connect, you can reach out to me at any one of these points. I will be sharing a copy of the slides from today's presentation with MEOPAR for distribution to participants, so you don't have to try and write all of this down. You'll be able to get it from that. And Rylan has put some of this contact information in the chat if you want to copy it down from there. Just some ground rules for our session and time together today. I would ask that you ask your questions at any time during the session. Please don't save them all up to the end. You're welcome to do that, but you are free to ask questions at any time. I can only keep so many windows on my screen open at any one time, so I will keep the chat window open. If you have a question, you can either type it into the chat or you can just indicate in the chat that you have a question and I'll call on you. But please don't use the raise your hand feature, as I'm not able to see that all the time. And because we're going to be touching on some things that might be new or unfamiliar to people, especially as we explore our experiences in working and learning virtual communications in our current virtual hybrid remote working world, I would remind everyone to be respectful and thoughtful and kind with your questions and comments today and all the time. So a quick poll for those who are with us today. Just to get a sense of what we're currently thinking and feeling about the remote working tools for communication that we're using. Zoom is a very popular and common one. That's where we're working right now, but you might have experience working with or be required to use other tools. So I just ask you to participate in the poll. Do you love it? Do you hate it? Do you like it, but it's problematic sometimes, or are you loath to admit that you actually really like it? Yeah, nobody's really totally in love with it or absolutely opposed to it. There's certainly things about working in this virtual world that are good, but like everything, there's pros and cons in this environment. So we're going to explore that a little bit more in the session today. Thanks for participating in that poll. All right, so what we're going to cover in the session today, we're going to be looking at some basics of communications, just to make sure that we're oriented and remembering that communication has some basic elements to it that don't necessarily change just because we're using virtual tools. Then we'll look at what the best approaches to communication are, and then how we can apply some of those learnings and principles to improve our virtual interactions. And I'll also be giving you some of my own personal tips and tricks about using Zoom specifically for enhancing the way in which we interact with each other. So let's look at the communication itself and what do we mean by communication? Communication is defined as when a message goes from a sender to a receiver and the receiver acknowledges back to the sender two things: that they have received the message and that they understand the message. This loop of message going to receiver and feedback going to sender, that's what communication looks like. When we don't have both of those pieces as a part of our interactions, we're not having communication, we're having something else. If messages are going out, but there's no mechanism for a response, or we're not expecting a response, we might consider that to be more what I would call broadcasting or reporting, not communication, because we're not having that loop. But as we all know, there are many things that get in the way of good or effective communication. I would just ask you to quickly think about what are some of the things or barriers that you have experienced or are aware of to good communication, and just pop some of those in the chat box, some things that you have experienced that get in the way of having that effective communication feedback loop. Yeah, jargon is definitely one of the things that can get in the way. I know I work in a very highly technical environment, but it's also very specialized. So if I was to start to use a lot of the jargon around personalized oncogenomics, some of you might find that a little tricky to navigate. Unclear messages, and so we might consider that to be messages that are incomplete, or again, using language or jargon that we're not familiar with. Language barriers, so where we are interacting with people that have a different first language than us, there may be some things that are misunderstood. Oh, as someone has indicated, sometimes there are impairments or things that get in the way of hearing. And so thinking about different ways that we can share our information that's not just verbally or orally, but has other tools to support that. Yeah, having lots of channels of communication can cause some interference or some challenges because we're never sure where to get the information that we're looking for, and misinterpretation. So again, if things are unclear and we make an assumption or an interpretation about it as a receiver, we could say that we're understanding the message when in fact we're not. All of those are examples of things that get in the way and present some challenges to our communication being effective. As we said, there's language. There can also be cultural differences between people. When we make reference to things or idioms or common phrases that are common or popular to us, but are not necessarily shared across the country or across the groups that we're working with, that can result in some challenges. For example, my husband was born and raised in Newfoundland, and so sometimes he uses phrases as with me, somebody who grew up in Winnipeg, completely unfamiliar to me. I'm learning to adapt to them, but sometimes he comes up with things that are unusual, to say the least. We can have technology challenges that get in the way of things, and that can be the technology is interfering with our messages, or perhaps the sender and receiver are operating on different technology platforms, and so part of our message is going to get lost there. When our messages are received can also play a role in the ability for the receiver to get them and understand them. We can have messages that are incomplete, so not all of the information that is needed for the receiver to understand it is included, and perhaps they need to make some assumptions, and some of those might be incorrect. Or again, a lack of clarity. We might not provide all of the information that is needed, or we might make assumptions about what the receiver already knows, and so what we're communicating doesn't make sense to them. We also need to be aware of unconscious biases that come into our messages that can be distracting from what it is that we are trying to say. They interfere with the receiver's ability to hear what we're trying to say to them, because we've added some clutter or some bias to the message that we're delivering. And as we said, jargon and also noise. Somebody mentioned multiple platforms. We are all on the receiving end of so many different channels and so many different messages all day, every day, that being able to identify the messages that are the most important, the ones that we need to pay attention to, and the ones that we need to provide that feedback on, can be very, very challenging for everyone, and make it frustrating for the sender because they're not getting a response, and frustrating for the receiver because they can't tell what's important and what isn't. So things that we need to think about when it comes to our message. When we are the sender, we need to think very carefully about the words and the specific pieces of information that we are including in there. That is the meat of our message. What is it that we want to convey? We also need to be mindful of the level of urgency that's associated with what we're communicating, and we need to make sure that that's clear and part of the message that we're delivering. What's also included in the message, sometimes the emotion of the sender is part of that message as well. There's not just the information that we are wanting to convey, but also the feelings and underlying emotions that we want to convey to the receiver that are an important part of getting them to understand what we are trying to say. And we also have to think about, when we're constructing a message, what will the impact be on the receiver? Is that emotion as a part of our message appropriate for the person that we're communicating with? Are we sending our messages at a time that makes sense and gives the receiver the best opportunity to get and understand our message and respond to it? So I like to recommend that people consider applying what I refer to as the 3C principle for effective communications. And this is especially important when we're the sender and we're delivering the message. But when we think about that feedback loop, when we're the receiver and we're sending a message back that says, we've got your message and we understand it, we're in a way swapping places with the sender. Whenever we are distributing information out, we are the sender in that part of the communication. Just the purpose of what we're doing might be different. When we think about this, the 3C principle, first of all, we need to make sure that our messages are clear. They should be unambiguous and easy to understand by the person on the other side of it. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't include information about our emotions or background information about things, but we should, as much as possible, minimize the clutter around what we're distributing. We also need to make sure that our messages are concise. Again, this minimizes the noise, respects the time of the receiver of our message so that they don't have to try and sort out within all of what we've said to them, what is the nugget of information that we actually need to take some action on. So we need to make sure that things are concise. At the same time, we also need to make sure that our messages are complete. They have to include everything that the receiver needs to have in order to understand that. Now, we need to balance that completeness and conciseness when it comes to delivering our messages so that they can be well understood. And one of the ways that we can think about doing this is an approach known as framing our message. In this, we need to think about what it is that we want to say. Why is it that we need to communicate this to this person or have this communication with the receiver? We need to make sure that our message includes the context and the bigger picture. So I'm asking you this because of this larger project that we are involved in. If there is urgency around the need to respond to something, we need to make sure that that's included in our message as well. And lastly, if we're needing them to take some action, not just responding to us that they've received and understood our message, but we need them to take some action. We need them to provide some additional information. We need them to go and talk to somebody else. We need them to conduct some experiments as a part of the project that we're working on. Being specific about what it is that we need them to do is an important part of making sure that our message is clear, concise, and complete. So here's an example of how we might construct a message so that it is framed in a way that the receiver has the best chance of understanding it and taking the action that we need them to take. So first we think about the what. We might say the annual report that we're all working on includes a section on metrics, which is your area of expertise. So that establishes the what and why am I sending you this particular message. We provide the context. So we might think about this a little as the urgency, but also the bigger picture of why we're having this interaction. This report is our last obligation before we get paid for the work. So that ensures that people understand the significance and importance of why we're having this conversation. We establish some urgency. We have a deadline that we need to be meeting with this particular activity. And so we make sure that that's clear and understood in the message that we're delivering. We've got 4 weeks to finish this. And so then we get specific about what it is we need the person to do. I need you to review this section and get back to me with any corrections by the end of this particular day. And I provide an option. If you can't do that, here's what I need you to do instead. And that's an important part to include in any message, is giving people that option. If I'm asking you to do this and you can't do it, you need to tell me, and here's the other options that you have. The thing that happens if we don't provide that option, if the person can't meet that deadline, but we don't tell them what else we need them to do, the deadline will just come and go, and we won't necessarily get what we need. They won't be able to be successful and effective in what we're doing. So this is a very simple and straightforward way of thinking about framing our message and helping to make sure that our messages are clear, concise, and complete. I want to just give you a quick example from my own experience of messages being clear, concise, but not necessarily complete. Or sorry, concise and complete, but not necessarily clear. So I had somebody that I worked with, they forwarded me a big long email string, something that they were working on. And the message to me was FYI ... And so as like everybody, I get hundreds of email messages every day, and some of them are literally just for my information. So you know that this is what I'm working on. So when I got this message from the person, that's what I thought it was. She was just keeping me posted on the work that she was doing on that particular project. I didn't see anything that popped out at me as context or urgency. And so I just, put it aside. I didn't even reply, because it's not the kind of message that FYI is expecting a response or should be expecting a response. But a couple of days went by and they emailed me again and said, "Are you able to answer that question?" And that was when I realized, oh, actually, there was something that they needed me to do in that. So I scrolled down through this big long string of emails and found several emails down that there was an outstanding piece of information, and somebody had suggested that I would be the best person to get that information from. So the message that the person has sent to me, it definitely met the definition of being concise, FYI ... You don't get much more concise than that. And it definitely was complete, because that whole email string had all of the information that I needed in order to be able to understand their question and be able to get back to them. The problem was it wasn't clear. What was it that she needed me to do with all of that information? The context was there, but there was nothing about the urgency. There was nothing about what it was that she needed me to do. And there wasn't anything specific about the actions or the timeline around what she required of me. So we need to think about framing our message and applying those principles whenever we are sending something out, in order to give the person the best opportunity to reply to us with that confirmation that they've received it and understood it, and that they'll be able to take the actions that we need them to take. I wanted to share this little flow chart as well, as a thinking process that we can go to when we're a part of a larger group discussion, for example, and we're putting up our hand, or we're contributing to the conversation that's going on. We've probably all been in meetings or those kinds of conversations where people are talking and are sharing information, but it's not anything that's new. It's perhaps off topic. It's a repeat of something that somebody else has said, and it's taking up time within that meeting that's not actually contributing to the advancing of that particular idea or the solving of that problem. And so this "why am I talking" flowchart helps us to evaluate what it is that we think we want to say. Is it necessary to invoke another communication channel, or perhaps distract the conversation that's going on? Or is it something that's already been well covered in the meeting or conversation that's happening? And this is a way that, again, we can make sure that all of our communications are framed and clear, concise, and complete by thinking about whether what we are going to contribute to the conversation is actually adding to it or not. And we can help to minimize the noise that goes on in some of those interactions. When we think about effective communication, and particularly the messages that we're wanting to send out, what we're trying to accomplish is that what we want to say becomes the same as what we actually say, and what is heard and understood. And if we're doing a good job of applying that 3C principle and framing our message and thinking about the audience that we're working with, we'll have the best opportunity to make sure that the messages that we're sending out are heard and understood, and that sender role within communication will be done as effectively as possible. But within the communication flow, we have the sender and we also have the receiver. And we can think about the receiver as the person who is listening or reading or hearing or viewing what it is that the message that we're sending out. So we call this listening, but it could be anything that we're receiving the messages that we get. So when we think about why we listen, what would be some of the reasons? And I'd again ask you to use the chat for this. What are some of the reasons that we listen to what's going on in the communications in the meetings, that we read the information that's provided to us, or that we watch the videos and the things that are sent to us? What is the purpose of doing that from a communications perspective? Yeah, we listen to ensure that we're understanding things, to learn, to be informed, to confirm that we understand something. We're listening for those cues, those pieces of information that are going to tell us, reinforce that we understand something, or tell us something different about what's going on. Any other reasons that we listen or watch or read? Yeah, we listen to connect with others. We learn about other people through what it is that we're reading or hearing from them, and that helps us to understand them better and be able to connect with them. Maybe we learn the ways that they like to communicate through listening to the ways that they're communicating with us. Yeah, all of those are important pieces. We listen to help others by connecting with them and perhaps hearing about their experiences so that we can then communicate with them and provide them with support. We listen to understand information and what's going on around us, but we also listen to learn new things. So things that we're unfamiliar with, things that we need to learn how to do. We do that through listening and reading and watching. We also sometimes listen or read or watch to enjoy. There isn't an ulterior motive other than we want to get some pleasure out of doing it. And that's a valid reason. It is actually a part of communication as well. That enhancement to our emotional well-being is something that comes from listening or reading or watching. We can think about these things across a hierarchy of where our focus is when we're listening. When we're listening to help, we're focusing on others. We're listening so that we can then provide them with some support or information in order to help them. When we listen to understand and to learn, we're focusing on both others in terms of getting information from them or perhaps giving information feedback to them. And when we listen to enjoy, we're focusing more on ourselves and getting things out of that information. Mostly when we're thinking about effective communication, and particularly in the workplace, we focus on those middle two pieces, listening to understand and listening to learn. And we want to be effective listeners when it comes to the being on the receiving end of those communications. So some things to remember when it comes to being an effective listener. First of all, we have to pay attention to what the sender is saying. And also to the sender themselves. There's information that the sender is giving you, not just in the words that they are communicating, but in other elements of the message that are being delivered. We also make sure that we need to listen to understand. As they say in many areas, everybody has got the opportunity to listen and understand what's going on, paying attention to the messages that are being delivered and trying to critically think about what it is that we're hearing so that we can understand it. We also need, when we're listening and reading and watching effectively, we need to defer our judgment. We need to hear the message that's being delivered, take that on board and analyze it, and try and minimize our own unconscious biases and filters getting in the way of that message and information coming to us. And that's particularly important when we are listening to understand and when we're listening to learn. Then we need to think about responding appropriately. If we're the receiver in that communication feedback loop, the way in which we respond needs to be appropriate to the sender and to the message. How quickly we need to respond, the tools that we use to respond, and the message that we then construct as our response needs to be appropriate and effective for the sender and the message. And we need to pay attention to ourselves. We are the listener, and what we're hearing and seeing and reading will have an effect on us. Maybe it will give us new information, which is surprising. We need to think about, are we paying attention or are we being distracted by things around us? So we need to be mindful when it comes to being an effective listener. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about mindful listening later on in the session today. Thinking then about the sending of messages and the receiving of messages, when we think about good communication, there really is one approach to communication that is the best, that gives us the most opportunity to both deliver a complete message and to receive and understand that message completely. And that is this one-on-one, face-to-face interaction. It doesn't have to be in a coffee shop. It can be in an office. It can be while you're out for a walk with someone. It can be in a more formal meeting setting. But that one-on-one, face-to-face interaction is the best way for us to communicate because it provides a lot of opportunities. There's a lot of channels of communication that are opened up when we are in a face-to-face, one-on-one interaction. And all of those things contribute to our ability to communicate well and to understand and hear well the messages that are coming to us. When it comes to the opportunities, there are lots of channels that we are using. There's the words that we are delivering, but there's also the tone of voice that we can only hear when we're listening to somebody. There's the body language that the person is using. Are they being assertive and aggressive, or are they being a little bit passive and shy and scared? That gives us information about what the message is. If you're someone like me who talks with their hands and uses their body a lot, the way in which I'm using those things helps to communicate my message, not just the words that I'm saying. There's the overall presentation. Is the person casual? Is the person distracted or engaged with what they're doing? There's the facial expressions that we can see when someone is talking to us. Again, we can tell sometimes if somebody's talking to us and they're delivering a message, but the look on their face says that they're confused or that they're angry. That tells us additional information about what it is that they're trying to say. And lastly, we get eye contact. When we sit face to face and one-on-one with someone, or within a small group of people, we're able to make eye contact with people. And that helps to ensure attention, but it also helps to convey information by showing that we're paying attention and making that connection with someone. Now, all of those channels create lots of opportunities for information to get out and for us to communicate, but all of those channels also result in some problems as well. First, there's so many channels to pay attention to, but all of these can lead to different kinds of problems because now there isn't just one thing. It isn't just an email that we have to read. There's all of these other things going on that we have to pay attention to. So this can lead to mixed messages. Again, what I might be saying and the look that's on my face might be quite different. And so I'm going to have to try and figure out, is it the words that are important, or is it the look on her face that's important that I need to pay attention to? That can also lead then to misinterpretation. I might pay attention to the words and not the body language, or not the look on someone's face. And so I'll misinterpret or misunderstand what it is that they're trying to tell me. The emotions that come along with some of those other nonverbal channels, the body language, the hand-to-body movement, the facial expressions, even the eye contact or the lack of eye contact that might be occurring, can give messages about emotion that can then make it so that we're not hearing the words anymore. And so we're missing some of that. Or we, again, might be misinterpreting somebody's emotions based on their body language. If we don't know them very well, we don't necessarily know that that's just the way that they communicate. The environment in which we're sitting, if we're in the office, or we're in somebody's office, or we're in a meeting, or like we showed in the previous picture, we're in a coffee shop, more casual environment, that can influence the type of message that we're hearing and receiving, and the way in which we're able to deliver deliver it. We can also, because there's so many channels and so many different pieces of information coming in, it can be intimidating, particularly if the message is difficult. All of those other channels can actually make it harder on the person delivering the message or on the person receiving message, and can communicate things that we don't intend. And it can mean that we're not listening very well because there are so many things going on. We're paying attention to Robyn moving her hands and we're not necessarily hearing the words that she's saying, which means that we're not able to listen as well as we might like to. All of those factors play into all of the other kinds of communications and tools that we have. When we're not using one-on-one face-to-face, some of those other things go away, and that can be a good thing, but it can also be a challenging thing because we lose some of those things, and it leads to us making misinterpretations and misunderstandings. We've probably all had the experience of receiving text messages or emails or even voicemails from people that when we hear them or read them sound very terse and sound very stern, when in fact just the person on the other end, they were just in a rush, and so they had to do something very quickly. But we start to interpret emotions or other messages in those things that are not really there, and suddenly we have a whole other channel of communication and message that was never intended to be there. Some of that goes away in a face-to-face interaction because first of all, we can see it all, but second of all, we have an opportunity to immediately interact and ask for clarification and support around that. So I was going to do a breakout group as my next thing, but we're a small enough team of people online today that we can use just the chat, and I'll open up the gallery so I can see everybody in case you want to raise your hand and chat and talk. I would ask you just to think about and then share with the group where you see some of the opportunities as well as the challenges with the communication that we've just talked about when it comes to using virtual meeting tools. What are some of the things that work really well in using a virtual meeting tool that overcome some of those issues? And what are some of the challenges that are made worse or even added to by using virtual meeting tools? Go ahead, Bridget.
Thanks, Robyn. One thing that I think can be both an opportunity and a challenge is I really like the chat function in Zoom. And I think for some meetings, it has been helpful. Like if somebody is kind of not sure where to go next, or it can be nice to send a little message and be like, hey, remember this, or hey, maybe this is something you should mention. So it can cause some distraction, but I think it can also be a benefit. And for someone like me who, like when you're giving your presentation, I typically keep my camera off, but it's a way that I can react either using the chat or using the react on Zoom. So I do think that is a benefit. And then it's also, I don't have to stare at myself the whole time I'm in meetings. The first few months of the pandemic, nobody turned their camera off. So I just always felt like I had to have it on. So I would have self view, but you're still sometimes like 6 hours on Zoom a day. I've never looked at myself this much before.
That's right.
Yeah, so I think that can be both a challenge and a benefit. But yeah, the Zoom chat has been really great for me, especially as the person typically taking notes. Like if I don't know how to spell somebody's name, I can ask somebody who mentioned it so that I'm sure to capture that properly. So it's been a great.
And that's a great way of using that tool to address the why am I talking thing that I talked about earlier. If there's 25 people on a call, do you really need everybody to pay attention to you just checking on the spelling of somebody's name that they mentioned, or could you just do it in sidebar? And we used to do that in live meetings. You just sort of slip somebody a note or turn to them and whisper. That's kind of what chat allows you to do in a way that doesn't disrupt the flow of the meeting. Yeah, that's exactly right. I was going to mention the hide self view later on as a way of minimizing distraction. So we'll talk about that again later. Go ahead, Alexa.
One of my biggest challenges is poor internet connection. And sometimes when things lag, I'll start talking before someone else is finished. And then I come off as rude because I'm interrupting. And then I'm like, oh no, there was just a delay. So one of those, that seems to me as one of the biggest challenges, but I also think that, it does present an opportunity to wait a little bit longer before you start, but then it's finding that balance of knowing when to interject. I'm someone who relies a lot on body language, and so sometimes it's hard to filter that through the screen and knowing when you should interject. So I really like that the raise hand function. I think that's a great asset to Zoom.
Absolutely. Thanks. Anybody else?
Yeah, I can share something.
Go for it.
Yeah, I guess one of the benefits too is like I'm in consulting right now, and it is, you know, in terms of talking more with communities that you may not meet as much because of costs and going out there. At the same time, like I do prefer in-person meetings, and there's so much value to working with communities and being on site and making those connections. But it does allow for more of that, and people are getting more comfortable. That decreases some of the costs associated with that.
Yeah, I can relate to that a lot as a consultant trainer. Certainly the opportunities that for things that I've been able to participate in. This is a perfect example. I would not have been able to afford to attend and participate in the MEOPAR annual training meeting if I had needed to travel. And MEOPAR probably couldn't afford it there. So it would have been a challenge. So it definitely opens up an opportunity for connections, and even in a more timely manner than what we might have expected previously, because it's a tool it's another tool in the toolbox of the way that we interact with people. Great. Anybody else? Go ahead, Alexa.
I'm not sure if you're going to touch on this, but I think especially at the start of the pandemic and kind of midway through, there was a let's just hop on Zoom really quick. Let's have a meeting, and knowing the balance between what should be a meeting and what should be an email thread.
Yes.
I'm not sure if you're going to touch on that, but that's just one of the opportunities and challenges, that we have so much flexibility and so many channels to communicate, and knowing what's most appropriate.
Yeah, that why am I talking tool that I showed you, that author has a few other flowcharts like that, including why am I sending this email? And I think there is another one that says, why are we meeting? And it addresses exactly that. Is this necessary? And in the old days, in the pre-pandemic days, sometimes that was a deciding factor for people. Do I want to call a meeting, try and find a time for all of these people to be available, find a meeting room that's available to accommodate all of us, and then think about, I'm going to get 10 people together and use up, because all meetings tend to be booked for a whole hour. I'm going to use up 10 hours of personnel time. Or could I just, pick up the phone and talk to people, or could I, walk around the office and, get some information? So it does allow it creates that opportunity for another channel of discussion, but it also, like so many tools, we have to use it appropriately and effectively in order to make sure that we're not creating waste and just another confusing communication stream. Yeah, and as I'm going to pronounce your name probably incorrectly, Magana. There's an assumption that everybody has access to a computer and a phone, and that is correct. Certainly, when we first started, our transition to a hybrid workforce back at the beginning of the pandemic, that was something that was a challenge for many people. Not everybody has a smartphone that they're able to use in the way that that we might want them to, and certainly when everybody went home, not everybody has a computer at home that has the tech that we need. And we're going to talk about the tech in a little bit, but it was an assumption that was incorrect in a lot of cases. If we're going to use virtual meeting tools effectively, some of that tech does need to become a part of our standard toolkit in the ways that that we work, and identifying what those are and what works best for us is one of the ways that we can use these tools effectively moving forward. But certainly at the beginning of the pandemic, that was an incorrect assumption that everybody had sufficient Wi-Fi, that everybody had a webcam, that everybody was willing to use their phone for work-related things. All of those were things that we needed to change a little bit and adapt to. Thank you all very much for that discussion. As always, if there's other comments or questions that you have throughout the session, please don't save them up to just breakout groups. If you have a question or comment, please use the chat to do that. I'm going to turn off my gallery so I won't be able to see raise your hands for a little bit, but please use the chat for doing that. So when we think about those opportunities and challenges that happen in face-to-face interactions, when we add the virtual interaction to that, and we think about one-on-ones or even a smallish group meeting like this, we can think about that virtual environment and what are the additional challenges that adds to those interactions. We have distractions, we have distortions. So again, we can have those tech issues or the delays or lags in what's happening. We have challenges with what I refer to as pixel contact. I'm not looking anybody in the eye. I am looking at a certain point and hoping that you're perceiving that I'm looking you in the eye. We also have fatigue. As I've heard from many people, while we still have probably as many meetings as we used to have, we don't get to go anywhere. We just sit in one spot and have all of our meetings in that place, and that gets to be a bit of a drag after a while. We can have tech issues, and we can also have the impersonality of these interactions because we're not physically in a room with people. It can make all of those interactions feel less personal than we might want them to be. But there are some things that I think we can do to get through some of those. And I'm going to go through what I would consider to be the tips and tricks that I've learned over the last 20 months of both working in my work environment, but also as a consultant and a trainer, some of the things that I've learned that have allowed me to take advantage of and adapt to delivering a lot of my material in a virtual environment. So we're going to look at these things about the technology, about making eye contact, about being professional and respectful in our presentations, reducing our distractions, and then lastly, we'll touch on some etiquette things, especially as we move into a more hybrid environment where sometimes we're on site and sometimes we're at home. So thinking about the technology or the tech that is associated with it, we really want to make sure that with the technology that we're using, that we can hear and be heard, and that we can see what's going on and be seen in the virtual environment. So when it comes to hearing, we should make sure that we've got some way of hearing what's going on. And I highly recommend, whether you're working at home or you're working in an office where there's other people, having some kind of headset that allows you to hear what's going on very clearly is very highly recommended. A lot of people use the speaker on their computer, and it broadcasts into the room where they're sitting, and that can be fine if you're by yourself. But it is the quality of sound that you're getting from that is a lot lower, and it is harder to hear quiet things that are happening. When it comes to being heard, having some kind of microphone. And again, most computers or laptops will have a built-in microphone, but the quality of sound that is going to come to through that is not going to be as good as if you have a more dedicated microphone. The headset that I use, it's a wired headset, which makes me not very cool because most people use some sort of Wi-Fi setup. Over the course of the last year and a half, I've tried 5 or 6 different versions of headsets, the Apple headphones, the Apple earbuds, a couple of different versions of a wireless headset. And what I found with all of those is that there were always some sort of problem with, particularly with the Wi-Fi ones, there would be disconnection problems or lack of clarity through the microphone. With some of the ones that are wired, you're kind of tethered to the desk where you're working, and that be a challenge. But I've found that this particular headset, the microphone is very, very clear, and I find that the headphones themselves are pretty comfortable. I don't like wearing them for 8 hours in a row, but I can wear them for 3 or 4 hours and still be pretty comfortable. They're very light and they're very inexpensive. This pair of headphones with the microphone is $40, and I've never had to replace them, knock wood, in about 5 years of using them for a variety of purposes. When it comes to seeing and being seen, again, you want to, if you're going to spend a lot of time looking at things, and particularly if you're going to need to look at slides or materials that come in meetings, or you need to look at lots of people that are involved in a meeting, having a sufficient monitor that's clear and of good quality to allow you to see what's going on, and also using a camera so that you can be seen as a part of meetings. Now, not everybody wants to be seen in meetings, and that's totally fair, and it's everybody's choice to do that, but it does help enhance the engagement with others if when you are speaking you can be seen. You don't have to have your camera on all the time, and I'm going to talk about the times when it's actually appropriate to shut your camera off, but having that ability to be seen when it's appropriate is one of the ways that we can enhance our work in that virtual environment. The last point I'll mention is to think about the background, particularly when you're using a camera. What's going on behind you is a part of what people are seeing in your message, and particularly if, like me, you're delivering a presentation, people are looking at you all the time. And so what they can see behind you can sometimes be part of your message. You also want to be respectful to them. Don't show off your messy room, wherever that happens to be. And so thinking about that background, but also thinking about the lighting and the environment that you're in. And that can be challenging if you're not a camera or photography expert, but thinking about having appropriate lighting behind your monitor that's lighting you up, and also the lighting that's coming behind you to make sure that you can be seen and your background can be seen. And you can check on that kind of thing pretty quickly. If you've got a camera, you can see what you look like, and that's what other people are seeing. But you can also use Zoom or whatever the tool is that you're working in. Just on your own, open up your personal meeting room, see what you look like on that monitor, and adjust your background, adjust your lighting, and think about the way it is that you're going to be seen. And that allows us, by being seen, to be engaged and engaging and a part of the interactions that we're having. Particularly if it is a one-on-one interaction, we should be seen when we're in those kind of discussions. When it comes to what I call maintaining pixel contact or eye contact, an important way to think about this is to figure out where to look. Now, we've all probably experienced this, that when we're interacting with somebody in a meeting or a group, it looks like they're looking at something else. Sometimes they are. They're checking their email or their phone, or they're doing something else other than paying attention to us. But if you're involved in delivering messages, but even if you want to be respectful with the people that you're interacting with, figure out when you're using your camera where it is that you need to look on your screen so that you are looking people in the eye. So I took these when I was building this presentation. I took these pictures on from my screen on the weekend, and depending on what I'm doing, I'm not looking at the camera. It looks like I'm looking at something else. I'm looking up at the corner. I'm looking down at the floor. I'm looking directly into the camera, but that's a little disconcerting and uncomfortable for me. What you want to figure out is where is it that you need on the screen. And for me, with where my camera is and the way it works with Zoom, I need to look at my screen about 3 inches down from the camera. And when I do that, hopefully what you're seeing is I'm looking right at you. And that's a way that I can make sure that part of the message that I'm delivering is I'm connecting with you. You are paying, that I'm paying as much attention to you as I can when there's multiple people involved. You're not always going to be able to do this. And certainly I find when I'm delivering a presentation or there's lots of people talking, so I've got a big gallery of people open, my eyes are moving around a little bit on the screen, but that's actually consistent with how it would be if I was live and in a meeting with people. I wouldn't be looking at every single person all the time. But as much as possible, if we can figure out how to maintain that contact, my pixels looking at your pixels, we're able to simulate to a large extent that face-to-face one-on-one interaction. When it comes to presenting information, when we're the communicator, so we're the deliverer of the message, some things that we can think about that make our presentation and the way we're appearing both professional and respectful. So I've already mentioned the idea of having a background and thinking about using a virtual background, whether it can be a blurry screen or it can be a particular picture. You want to make sure that it's professional and that it reflects to some extent the message and the environment that you're working in, and maybe supports what it is that you are trying to say. But you can also make it a little bit personal as well, something that is meaningful to you. And that's part of how we make connections with people. Very often when I'm doing a presentation or participating in a meeting, the picture that will be behind me will be something from a recent vacation, or so a landscape photo of a recent vacation, or something that is meaningful to me. When I have meetings around Canada Day, I've got a Canada flag behind me because that's important to me. Things like that. We can make them a little bit fun and personal, but they should still be professional and respectful, and not too busy, not too much going on in the background that people are less paying attention to you and more paying attention to trying to understand what's going on in your background. Of course, we also need that to be tidy. So if we're not able to, sometimes the tools that we use, I know when I sometimes have to have a meeting in Microsoft Teams, I don't have a license for Microsoft Teams, so I'm not always able to have a background. People just get a bird's eye view of my living room or my office, if that's where I happen to be. And so as much as possible, just make sure that that's tidy, partly because you want to be respectful of the environment in which you live, if there's other people there, but also because you want to minimize the distractions for the people that are looking at what you're doing. When you're using a tool like Zoom or Microsoft Teams, you can put your name in the tool. And you can do that live within the meeting, and it's important that you use your own name in that as much as you possibly can. If it's a group license, then it's going to be the group's name. But I've had the experience of being in meetings with people, and they're using their family Zoom account, and so the name that's on the Zoom that's appearing there is quite clearly not the person that I'm talking to. And if I'm using something like a waiting room where I'm trying to let people in who are supposed to be a part of that meeting, I'm not necessarily going to recognize that that's a person that should be there. So that's part of the reason that you want to use your own name, and also so that if you want to put up your hand or you want to engage in the chat, the people know who's talking when we have that. And lastly, just using the mute button and the hiding your video button appropriately. If you are not paying attention to what's going on in the meeting, you're typing away on your emails or you're doing something else while things are going on, it is only respectful that you mute yourself so we don't all have to listen to you typing. And if you're not, you definitely are turning away to take a phone call or do something else, or if you're eating or drinking in the midst of a meeting, it's just respectful to mute that and maybe turn off your camera while that's going on. If for no other reason, then it can be distracting to the other people that are involved in the call. And so using that mute and hide appropriately, turning them back on when you have a question or when you're needing to re-engage with that, but also making sure that you're being respectful of the person who's talking. Another thing we need to do is reduce our distractions. Because we're not going to a specific place for the meeting to occur. We're often sitting at our desks where we've been sitting for a long time. And we want to make sure that we're paying attention to what's going on. So some of the things that we can do to make sure that we're not distracted by what's going on, keep your desk in front of you where you are sitting to work on this. Keep it tidy. Don't have a whole bunch of things around that you need to shuffle and move around in order to find what you're looking for. Think about making sure that the space where you are is not just providing distractions to you. Similarly, the monitor or desktop where you're working, try not to have a whole bunch of other windows open while you're supposed to be in the Zoom meeting and paying attention to that. And this includes, and it's one of the things that I do, is I turn off the things that have notifications. So I turn off the notifications for my messages and for my email and for my internet or for my web browser, excuse me. None of those are going to come on and distract me while I'm in the midst of a meeting or a presentation. And similarly, turn off your other apps. If you have your phone sitting beside you, make sure that it's on silent. It's one of the things, some of the people I work with, they they leave that on. And so in the midst of a meeting, suddenly we'll hear somebody's phone ringing, and then they'll pick it up and they'll take their call and they'll forget to mute themselves. And so we're all hearing about them ordering their lunch or talking to their children or whatever. So we need to think about doing that. And again, using the mute and hide when we need to step away from things. I was giving a presentation yesterday, and I needed to step away from the computer. So I just said that I'm going to step away from the computer for a few minutes. I muted and hid my camera so that I could go away and refill my water glass without everybody listening to me going into the kitchen. And lastly, another really good way to reduce the distractions that you see when you're participating in a meeting is to do this thing called hide self view. And I only learned about this a couple of months ago. And every time I share this tip and trick with people, or have shared it with people, they didn't know about this. And they've found it to be a revelation and a huge improvement in their environment in Zoom. So apologies if you already know about this, but for those who don't, this is a huge benefit. So I just took these screen captures when I put this together over the weekend. If you're looking at the gallery in Zoom right now and you hover over your own face, you'll see those three little dots, or the ellipsis as they call it, up in the corner. If you click on that, you'll see this drop-down menu, and one of the options is hide self view. And what this does when you click on that is it gets rid of your own picture. And again, as somebody like me who talks with their hands, I'm very distracting in a group setting, and I don't want to be distracting to myself. So if I hide my self view, now I'm paying attention to the presentation and to the other people that are in the meeting. If I was in a meeting room with a bunch of people, I wouldn't be able to see myself. So why should I see myself when I'm in a virtual environment either? So as much as possible, I try and do this at the beginning of every meeting. It does mean that if you have your camera on and your video is live, you have to remember that your video is live and everyone can see you. But that takes less practice than it takes to start to keep ignoring yourself when it comes to the view. And sometimes that's preferable to hiding yourself. If you turn your video off so that people can't see what you're doing, you're still kind of there. But it also it can be distracting to continue to see yourself in that view. So it's something that I have learned recently, and I highly recommend as a way of getting rid of those distractions that can occur during a virtual communication. And then when you want to turn it on again, you just go back to the gallery, click on it, and one of the options that comes up is show self view again, and then you can go back to looking at yourself if that's what you like. So lastly, I just want to touch on some etiquette things, and these are important to think about because we'll be or are moving into what I would call a hybrid workforce, where some people are working remotely, some people are working on site, and that's all happening at the same time. But people who are on site have to be in Zoom calls or meetings. People who are working remotely are connecting just from wherever it is that they're working. And so we need to think about ways to be polite and respectful of each other in this new environment. So if we're working on site and there's other people around us, we need to recognize when people are sitting at their desk and they have their headsets on, or they're staring intently at their screen and taking notes, we should probably recognize that as that person's in a meeting. And so we probably shouldn't go up and tap them on the shoulder or walk up behind them and start talking to them because they're in a meeting. And we wouldn't do that if they were away in a meeting room. We wouldn't just walk into the room and start talking to them. And so we need to think about being polite and respectful of people in that situation and environment. And as in my own environment, as people started to migrate back into the workplace, this was one of the complaints that I heard fairly frequently in those early days was, I'm trying to have my regular meeting with my supervisor who is off site, and I'm sitting at my desk and people are walking up and bothering me and not recognizing that I'm on a Zoom call. We can also take some responsibility for that. We can stick a label on our computer that says, don't bug me, I'm on a Zoom call. But also we can be respectful of others in the workplace and just not bug them if it's very clear that they're on a Zoom call. We can also consider moving to a different location, maybe not sitting in the open area where everybody else is while we're having a call or a meeting, but move to another place. And that's also like being respectful to the people around us. Not everybody wants to hear or participate in the meeting that we're having. So maybe we can take it to another spot. One of the advantages at my institution of having so few people on site is so many meeting rooms and offices are now available for people to use to have these kinds of sessions and settings. We still need to be respectful of those spaces, but we have a lot more options when it comes to that kind of thing. When a bunch of us are on site and we are having a meeting, we need to make sure that we don't exclude the remote participants from those interactions. If we are having a meeting with 7 people and 2 people are off site, maybe everybody should participate in the meeting Zoom. Rather than have a bunch of people in a room and 1 person on the monitor. I know that seems like it's less personal than everybody being together, but it's also respectful and fair to those people that are working remotely. And if we're in a hybrid environment, sometimes we're going to be that remote person. And so we need to make sure that we find that right balance and just making sure that everybody's included. And if all participants are on site, then you don't have to use Zoom to meet. It's one of those rare occasions where you can actually bring people together. Of course, you have to do it safely, and so managing the density and the distances between people. But if everybody is available and on site to meet, then maybe don't use the virtual tool to do it. Try having an idea where we can meet all together would be a nice way of doing it old school. If we're working remotely, I've already talked about using the technology. We need to make sure that we've got it and we're using it well. If we're the only person who's working remotely in a large group of people that are working on site, well, we want those on-site people to be respectful of us and recognize that we're there. We also then have to take some responsibility and be a little bit more assertive about being heard. We can use the chat feature, we can use the microphone and the camera to make sure that we're present, but we might need to speak up a little bit more to make sure that what we are trying to contribute to that environment is being heard in the discussion that we're having. It's not to say that we own all of that responsibility, but there are things that we can do to make sure that we're being heard. We can use the raise hand function, we can turn on our microphone, we can use the chat as a way of making sure that we are engaging as well. And as much as possible, minimize what's going on around you. You probably can't hear it right now, but outside my window is a leaf blower, one of the worst inventions ever. And it's very noisy and distracting to me, but hopefully it's not what you're hearing. But as much as possible, minimizing what's going on in the background around you in that remote environment. Or if you know that you're going to be interrupted or you expect that there's going to be some noise, just let people know about that and apologize in advance. I might say at some time in the next hour, I'm expecting a courier delivery to come in, so I might have to press pause and step away from the meeting. Just let people know that that's going to happen. Everybody's had the opportunity to work remotely in the last several months, so we all know that stuff like that happens. But we should be respectful and let people know what's going on. And when we're working in a hybrid way, we need to respect and recognize that this is new and different for everyone. People are going to forget that someone's working remotely. It's not a deliberate or personal slight. It's just a mistake and an oversight. And we need to help people understand and learn and grow in that way. We probably all have had the experience in the past, pre-pandemic, of exactly that kind of thing happening, where we've been in a meeting and one person's been on a teleconference. They've been on that weird looking phone that's sitting in the middle of the room. And we remember to introduce them and call them out when the meeting is getting started. But then we forget that they're there and people are talking, quietly, or they're forgetting to ask the person if they have any questions. The person on the phone is trying to speak and not being heard because there's so much noise going on in the room. That is exactly the same situation that happens now, is just with Zoom instead of teleconferencing. And we all just need to recognize and be patient and engaging and respectful of people who are not in the room, but still need to be present and want to be engaged. So when it comes to being a respectful participant in any of these virtual interactions, as I said before, we need to be paying attention, minimize the other distractions that are going on. We talked about the benefits of having the chat feature there and being able to use it in a private way. Hey, Robyn, can you tell me how to spell that person's name? That's all really good, but we need to sort of project that a little bit to, if we were live in a meeting room, how distracting would it be for everybody if all of these little personal sidebar conversations were going on? And remember that whatever it is that we're saying in those private chats, those should still be respectful, whatever it is that we're engaging in. And whenever we're doing a private chat or a sidebar conversation, we're not paying attention to what's happening in the meeting. So we should use that tool effectively, but make sure that we minimize the distraction about that. If we're doing a Zoom recording, for example, one of the things, again, that I've learned recently is to make sure that you hide or minimize the video panel on the computer where the recording is taking place. And the reason that you want to do that is because, sorry, the leaf blower has just gotten really loud. The reason that you want to do that is to protect the privacy of those participants. If the video panel is captured in the recording, then the names and faces of those participants is captured in your recording, and that may not necessarily be what you want to do. Think about using the mute and unmute effectively, and again, the camera on and off effectively, to be respectful of the other participants. And lastly, to apply this approach of mindful listening that I mentioned earlier. We should be paying attention to what's going on in the meetings that we're involved in. There's a reason why we're there and why people want to be communicating with us. And so we need to apply this mindful listening approach to make sure that we're paying attention and getting the most out of the meetings that we're looking at. Mindful listening involves three things. It involves being present, so simplifying our surroundings, getting rid of those distractions, minimizing what's on our desk, allowing sufficient time to prepare, to engage in the meeting, and to close. One of the things that I do with all of my meetings now is a way of helping people engage in a mindful way. I mentioned before that we had this tendency previously for all meetings to be 1 hour long. Well, meetings don't have to be an hour long. And whenever I book a meeting now, I normally would have done it for an hour, I do it for 50 minutes, 50 minutes, so that every meeting, at the end of every meeting, every participant has 10 minutes in between this meeting and the next one where they can get up and walk around. They can go get a drink or a cup of tea. They can walk around the block. They can check their email. They have that opportunity to do something different so that when they come to their next meeting, they are prepared to engage and be mindful and participate in that meeting. So I have 50-minute 1 hour meetings, and I have 25-minute half-hour meetings, so that there's always this break in between. And if we think about what it used to be like when we were all meeting on site, we all had to move from one room to another. And whether we liked it or not, there was a break. There was a get up and walk and pick up your stuff and have a chat in the hall and go to the bathroom before you get to your next meeting. In a Zoom world, in a virtual world, we seem to have lost that because everything is back to back and there's no opportunity to get up and walk around. So I try and build that into my meeting schedules so that people have that opportunity as a way of making everybody have the best chance to be mindful. Of course, the next piece of mindful listening is to cultivate empathy. And this is about making sure that we consider our own perspectives and the perspectives of others, that we take a beat before we reply on something. So we make sure that we've heard and understood and we're clear about what it is that we're going to say. And that when we contribute something, that we do that in a way that is valid, that we can back up what it is that we are saying and contributing. Even if it's our own opinion, it's something that we can validate in the sense of, this is what I believe, this is what I know. And lastly, we need to pay attention to ourselves. We talked earlier about self-awareness when it comes to the way in which we're engaging in meetings or in one-on-one conversations, thinking about what it is that we're hearing, thinking about all those other channels of the messages that we might be getting, but also listening to our own cues and responses about things, our own way that we're feeling, the way that we're standing or sitting, the way that the look that we have in our face. What is that telling us about the way that we're responding in that particular situation? And this is sometimes referred to as, what's the story you're telling yourself about this particular message or thing that you're encountering. There's an approach that you can use when it comes to being mindful about this experience, and it's called the walking the cube or the experience cube. And it's breaking down what you're hearing and the way in which you might want to respond to that by separating out your observations from your thoughts and your feelings and your wants. What is it that is actually going on? What am I thinking about that? How is that making me feel? And what do I want to have happen next? And all of that is a part of being mindful and paying attention to yourself and the people that you're interacting with. I was going to do another quick poll. I don't know how many of us are left on here, but let's just try this again. So having now learned some new tools and tips and tricks about things, how do you now feel about using this virtual environment? Still kind of the same as what we had before. Hopefully, though, that you've learned some things that will make using these tools more comfortable, more effective, maybe a little bit more familiar. And I think that last part, being familiar, is important because these tools are not going away. This is what our working world is going to look like, particularly as we move into a hybrid working world going forward. And so finding ways to use these tools effectively is going to be just as important as when we learned how to use voicemail, or when we first, for those of you who can remember, when we first started using email as a tool in the workplace. It was new and unfamiliar. We made a lot of mistakes with it. Now it's just one of the things that everybody uses, and we love to hate it, but it's something that we all have to use. So just in closing, the lessons learned that I hope you would take away from today: when we think about our role as a sender in communication, remembering the 3C principle and framing our message so that we're delivering a message that's clear, concise, and complete, and has everything that the sender or the receiver needs. When we're the receiver, we need to apply effective and perhaps mindful listening approaches so that we give the message the best opportunity to be heard and understood, and we're able to respond in a way that's appropriate and effective. We want to use the tools and approaches that are most effective for the messages that we want to deliver. We're going to be working a lot more in this virtual environment, but those things that we can learn from the best communication, that one-on-one, face-to-face communication, finding good ways to simulate or mimic those in the virtual world will allow us to make sure that our communications are effective. And lastly, that communication is two-way. Even when it's a session like this, where most of the talking is me, it's still a two-way situation. I'm looking for feedback and connection with the people in the audience. When we're in a meeting situation or a one-on-one interaction, it isn't just a broadcasting of messages. Communication is two-way with senders and receivers, acknowledgements and acceptances of messages. And with that, I will come to an end. And just a quick thank you again to MEOPAR for having me as a part of your annual training meeting, and for all of the participants for your time and your attention and your engagement on this session. And we have some time if we want to have some additional discussion, or again, ask me anything.
Robyn, I just want to say thank you. This has been really helpful and a lot of good reminders. Even now, I'm looking at you on my screen, but I'm like, I should be looking over here. But yeah, a lot of good reminders. And I think for a lot of us, like, we didn't have any training on how to move online, right? Like, we just had to do it. You were talking about like March 16th, and I remember making the decision of like, well, we work from home now and we'll just figure it out. And so, yeah, this has been incredibly helpful.
I'll give you another tip for what you just said. So not a lot of people know this, but so I've got the gallery open now on my monitor, and I know where on my screen I need to look to be looking at you. I can actually move people around in the gallery. So when I'm talking to you, I put the gallery right under my camera, and I move your face right to where it is that I need to be looking. So I can look at Alexa. And you can, if you know, if it's a small enough group, you can make sure that you're doing that, and it helps. If I can look at you, that's even better in terms of being able to look at things. So
awesome. Thanks, Robyn.
Thank you.
Echoing what Bridget said, thank you, Robyn, for so many useful tips on Zoom etiquette that I wish I had a few months ago, but better late than never.
Yep. We're all learning as we go. So many of these things none of us thought about a year and a half ago. And I think part of it was because we didn't think that this was going to go as long as it did. But also it was new. Nobody, as Bridget said, nobody had any training. It was just here, use this. And so we've all had to figure it out as we go along. But there's tips and tricks to be learned all along the way with any tool. And now that I've said all of that, they'll release a new version of Zoom and things will be different. But hopefully they'll keep some of the good things that are working.
All right.
All right.
Well, if there are no further questions for Robyn, or if you think of something later, you can always contact her by email or any of the other social contact options she provided earlier. And thank you again, Robyn, for such an informative session. We hope